Welcome everybody to our first webinar of the year. My name is Elizabeth Orline. I'm from the National Health Council, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on a look at rare disease listening sessions with NORD and the FDA. This webinar is, of course, a National Health Council webinar, and it's intended to support our patient advocacy organizations as well as our other members. The mission of the National Health Council is to provide a united voice for people with chronic diseases and disabilities and their family caregivers, and we hope that these webinars are able to support us in advancing our mission. So as many of you know and have been participating in our webinar series that's been ongoing since actually already in November of 2018, so more than a year now. This was formerly a National Health Council series that was specifically on clinical outcome assessment. We've broadened that theme a little bit for this year. It's now our webinar series on patient-focused medical product development. And the intent behind that is we'd like to continue covering topics under the clinical outcome assessment umbrella, but we also want to broaden the topics to include other topics such as patient preference research, patient engagement and clinical trial design, and in fact our next webinar will be back to the COA theme. But the focus of today's webinar will be to provide an introduction to NORD's experience working with the FDA on the rare disease listening sessions. These listening sessions are facilitated by FDA patient affairs staff and offers patients and caregivers an opportunity to speak directly to FDA staff about what's it like to live with a specific rare disease. And we're very fortunate today to be joined by two special guests who will be presenting. We have Andrea Furia-Helms, who's from the Food and Drug Administration, and Debbie Drell, who's the Director of Membership at NORD. Andrea is the Director of the Patient Affairs Staff in the Office of Clinical Policy and Programs in the Office of the Commissioner at the Food and Drug Administration. In her role, she coordinates cross-cutting patient engagement activities to ensure patients, caregivers, and advocates have opportunities to share their perspectives in the FDA regulatory meetings. Ms. Furia-Helms spent over 10 years in the FDA's Office of Health and Constituent Affairs, where she directed the FDA Patient Representative Program and coordinated patient engagement activities. And prior to FDA, she was the director of the Back to Sleep initiative, which is now known as Safe to Sleep campaign, a public-private partnership to educate communities on sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS, at the National Institutes of Health. So Andrea, we're very happy to have you here, and thank you for participating. And we're also, I'm also excited to introduce Debbie Drell. Debbie is the Director of Membership for the National Organization for Rare Disorders, NORD. In her role, she oversees all of NORD's membership programs, which support the collective and individual needs of rare disease patient organizations, patients, and patient advocates through education, research, advocacy, and mentorship. She coordinates over 290 patient organizations and more than 700 executive directors, founders, chief scientific officers, board members, and staff. And she has 18 years of leadership in nonprofit public health education, awareness, and advocacy. So Debbie, we're also very excited to have you presenting. And with that, I will turn it over to Andrea and Debbie. And for the folks who are on the line, we will be taking questions. We'll take questions at the very end. And everybody besides Debbie and Andrea are going to be muted for the duration of today's call. So if you do have a question, please go ahead and use the chat function on WebEx. If you click on the little panel for WebEx, there's a little icon for chat, and you can just submit the question via the chat function, and we will receive all of those, and I'll read aloud the questions at the end of the webinar to Andrea and Debbie. So Andrea and Debbie can go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for National Health Council for organizing this webinar series in particular, and today allowing us, FDA and NORD, an opportunity to share how patients and caregivers can get involved with our listening sessions. And I just want to sort of prepare you that Debbie and I, because we're partners in this, we sort of do a tag team effort, so you'll hear from us back and forth just to prepare you. Next slide, please. So before I get into this slide, I think it's important to talk about the importance of hearing from patients and caregivers and why we want to include them in our regulatory discussions. Patients and caregivers, they provide insights and issues, especially needs and priorities that are important to them and their families. And it's important to get those diverse opinions and experiences because it really sheds light on things like risk tolerance and potential benefit when it comes to medical product development and treatments. And of course, let's not forget the real world experiences in real world settings that remind us that all these products are for our patients and caregivers and remind us that it's about the human element here. So ultimately, patients are at the heart of FDA's work and activities. Now about this slide, it's a busy one, so I apologize for that, but it's only meant to demonstrate the ongoing patient engagement activities at FDA and how they've been increasing over the past 30 years. It's hard to pinpoint when patient engagement at FDA really started, but there was a significant increase of engagement at the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis in the late 80s. And since then, it has been increasing and evolving ever since, as you can see. Next slide, please. So a little bit about patient affairs. Who are we? What do we do? Before I get to that, I want to share a little background information about our history at FDA. There was an office that was established in the late 80s to interact with the patients and advocates, specifically with the HIV/AIDS community at that time. And the office eventually expanded to include oncology and eventually all serious and life-threatening diseases and conditions. And you're probably familiar, in more recent years, center-specific patient engagement components have been established, such as the patient-focused drug development and things like patient preference initiatives through the Center for Devices. And each of these center-specific issues are unique to the products they regulate. The patient affairs was established in late 2017, so we're still fairly new. And it was after a trans-FDA study on patient engagement activities that determined a need for a cross-center effort at the commissioner level with a focus on cross-cutting issues, and really to be a central entry point or a front door, if you will, for patients who do not know where to begin in contacting FDA and how to get involved. So we work very closely with the medical product centers, and that includes the Center for Drugs, Center for Biologics, and Center for Devices. And as well as there's other offices that we collaborate with, along with our patient communities that we serve. And ultimately, we're all trying to enhance patient engagement efforts. So the way we do this is through creating and assisting with public-private collaborations and partnerships like we have with NORD, and leading cross-cutting programs and activities for best practices to continually engage our patient engagement, and through our external communication platforms, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Next slide, please. So these are just some of our programs and activities, but today we're really focusing on the rare disease patient listening sessions, and then touching upon ways we are aiming to enhance communications and really encourage patient communities to engage with us. Next slide, please. So the patient listening sessions are a collaboration with our partner NORD through a memorandum of understanding to provide another way to encourage communication between the patient community and FDA staff. And they're really focused on informing regulatory decision-making. It helps educate review division staff about rare diseases. The listening sessions help patients and their advocates understand better FDA's mission and work just by participating in them. It provides a starting point to inform early stage research and development discussions. And what we've done is we conducted a pilot to assess the value of these listening sessions and establish a really solid process for conducting them to make sure that the added value is not only to FDA, but also our patient communities. Next slide, please. So there are two types of patient listening sessions. Sometimes they can be requested through FDA, through our review division staff, and that's usually when there's a specific set of questions that they want to ask a particular patient subpopulation. But patient groups can also request them, and those are really because patient communities feel like they want to share their experiences and perspectives with FDA. They might feel that FDA doesn't have a really good understanding of what it is to live with that condition or disease or care for someone with that 24/7. And I need to say that that we really rely on NORD for this, and particularly Debbie, for really getting these done successfully. We would not be able to do these successfully without her involvement and support. So we thank Debbie for everything you do for us. And I think that's why we are successful and have been successful with these. The links at the bottom of the page on the slide are resources for you, so you can explore more about the patient listening sessions, and also if you're interested in requesting one. Next slide, please. So let's just go a little bit deeper in what they are and are not. They are non-public, non-advisory discussions between FDA and patients and their caregivers and other advocates. They're typically held for about 1 to 2 hours, and they can be a combination of phone and in-person, or just phone and in-person alone. And that's really meant to facilitate participation from patients and caregivers across the country, because, you know, it's really challenging to get to FDA's campus. So we want to make sure we're getting as many broad perspectives as possible. And it's also meant to facilitate a quick understanding, like pulling these together real quickly for the perspectives of patient and advocates about disease burden, treatment burden, the daily impacts, and really what their priorities are in considering products to be developed to help manage their symptoms. They're not open to industry right now, and they're certainly not avenues for endorsing specific medical products. These are only focused on disease experience. They aren't really representative. They're very small, informal conversations, no more than 9 participants at a time. And they are certainly not meant to take place with any other input and engagement process at FDA, such as the patient representative program or the patient-focused drug development meetings. Next slide, please. So this slide is just to share all the listening sessions that have been conducted so far since the fall of 2018 when we launched the pilot. We completed the pilot in summer of 2019. And so far, in total, we've done 15. And we have, surprisingly enough, we have about 20 pending so far requests for this year, which I'm sure will continue to grow. But you can find all this information along with the summaries of these listening session meetings on our website. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to turn it over to Debbie to talk about NORD and their role in this whole process. Debbie?
Thank you so much. And it's definitely a collaborative effort that we have spent the last 18 months really learning about and refining, working together and hand in hand with our patient advocates and our patient advocacy organizations. And thank you to the National Health Council for having us on this webinar. So I'm Debbie Drell. I'm the Director of Membership at NORD, and a little bit of history for those of you who don't know. NORD was founded in 1983 with an informal coalition of rare patients and organization leaders, starting with Abby Myers, if you're familiar with her, a leader in the rare disease history. And their first mission was passing the Orphan Drug Act. but that was the beginning of their large movement of bringing together rare disease organizations united under one umbrella. Much like the National Health Council, we believe in the power of the united voice. And for the National Health Council, it's 160 million people. With NORD, it's 30 million Americans living with rare diseases. And since we are the oldest umbrella rare disease organization, and our origins were in legislation and policy with the Orphan Drug Act, we are now known as the purest patient voice for rare disease community on the Hill. There are other actors in the field, and we are aware of them. We are the rare organization, literally and figuratively, that does not have industry on our board. We're the rare umbrella organization. There are many rare disease-specific organizations that do not have industry on their board, and that's one of our qualifications. But we're one of the rare umbrella organizations that does not have industry on our board, and Congress cares. And especially in this time of increased scrutiny with drug pricing and industry involvement in patient nonprofit advocacy, as you may all be aware of, it's all over the news. There's so much scrutiny on nonprofit organizations, and so we know this is important, and this is definitely a qualification for our organizations, and it's what we're known for. We take that very seriously. So we're a federation of nonprofits, and we care about our reputation on the Hill. When we go into meetings with members of Congress, they see us as the rare patient voice, unbiased by industry or other motivations, and we take the responsibility seriously. So our qualifications for memberships involve transparency, conflict of interest, good governance practices. And I mention all of this because it's important to the listening sessions. And I'll talk about that in the next slide. Next slide, please. So that's a picture of our member organizations, the leadership who attended our rare disease and orphan products breakthrough 2 years ago in October. We brought together about 140 of them last year in October, and we were so big, the picture, you couldn't really see people. You had to pull the camera back so far back. But the point of it is that we represent a diverse range of rare disease nonprofit organizations. And when you're working in the field for 36 years now, we have grown a large network of patients, patient advocates, nonprofit organizations, clinicians, and researchers. And we've been building a comprehensive database of rare disease reports, 1,200 of them, and those continue to grow each week. The reports are vetted by top leading experts in rare diseases. And on top of that, we do work with all 7,000 rare diseases. Any patient community that wants our support, we'll work with them. We will work to get them listed on our website. And so we have 1,200 of these rare disease reports and 1,200 nonprofit organizations that we work with. And they have various strengths and connections to NORD. We work directly with and have very strong relationships with 303 nonprofit organizations. And I know it was said earlier in my introduction that we work with 290. Since my bio last year, we've actually hit the 300 mark over the holidays. So we had a bunch of new members come through. So we're really happy to say that we're over 300 now of our member organizations, and they meet our standards to qualify. The point of sharing all of this is why would FDA work with NORD in this endeavor? And it's because we have connections, we have the relationships, we have trust, we have transparency, and FDA could potentially go directly to patients, or they could potentially go directly to nonprofit organizations. But in a rare disease listening session, there may be multiple organizations in the space. And those organizations are welcome to approach FDA in the patient-initiated listening session. But when the listening session is initiated by internal FDA review staff, we're not looking at one organization over another. We're looking at all the organizations. And the unfortunate effect or the unfortunate experience that we've seen are splinter groups, groups that don't work together, groups that don't talk together, maybe they don't even know that they exist. And so for us, there was a listening session where there were about 13 organizations in the space in the United States and around the world, and we reached out to each and individual one of them. NORD can be seen in a figurative Switzerland role. You know, we're neutral, we're reputable, we're trusted, we're the oldest in the United States. So when people see NORD approaching them, they know that we're working fairly and balanced in the community. So that's a little bit about NORD and why I mentioned those specific things. There's so much that I could say about NORD, but for the purpose of the listening sessions, our role in the community, our history, our origins, it's very important. And also individual patients, you know, we want to get everybody who's interested to express an interest in participating in these listening sessions. In this time of heightened divisions, partisan divisions, messaging in the community and in the world, anti-government messaging, people don't necessarily trust regulatory bodies. They don't trust the government. You know, there's so many messages out there proliferating. So the approach is, you know, a national nonprofit organization that works across all rare diseases to really invite them to create a space for them to feel that they can trust this process. So NORD and FDA developed an MOU detailing our roles, and we piloted this listening session. The Patient Affairs Staff Project leads with responsibilities like working with their internal review staff to identify requirements for the listening session, coordinating logistics. They develop the high-level summary. They serve as a point of contact for the centers, and we work together to develop educational materials for participants when that's needed. The role for NORD is a project lead in understanding the requirements for the participants, helping to develop the surveys that we would send out to collect responses, identifying participants, working with the patient organizations. And the hardest thing is when there's no patient organization, reaching out to the communities, reaching out to medical professionals, reaching out through social media, doing everything we can to really saturate those rare disease communities across every corner of the country. And we do that, and we've done that before. In collaboration with the patient affairs staff, we develop those educational materials and we distribute them. And sometimes when we solicit interest, individual patients may have concerns about participating in a listening session. This isn't uncommon for some to say, you know, I want to be heard and I want my voice to be heard, but you know, it's very emotional for me. Or I've never shared my story before. And we're not looking for the super advocates or the super activists. We don't need anybody to tell a speech. We don't need to have, you know, an auditorium inspired. It really is anybody that's affected by a disease has an important story to tell. No one story more important than another, but we are also looking for very specific things. Next slide, please. So what does it actually look like to coordinate a listening session from NORD's vantage point in our role? Step one, FDA division staff approaches patient affairs and a disease state is identified. Step two, NORD works with the FDA division staff and a date has been secured that works for all teams, and NORD then looks at the disease-specific organizations. If there are no organizations in the area, we create a plan for outreach to the community. We look at our rare disease reports. We look at our organizational database. We look at research and registries. We approach our medical professionals and researchers, and that's where 36 years in the field come into play. We look at diseases that may be in the same clinical subspecialty areas, oncology, hematology, neurology, et cetera, and do one-to-one phone calls with leaders in those spaces to identify where there might be opportunities to find patients within that area. So when there's no organization, we do extra work. If there are multiple organizations, then we work with all of them and we craft special messages, including educational materials on what to expect to get involved, links to conflict of interest. We let them know, you know, we have this survey that's developed across NORD and patient affairs. We test the survey, and the survey is really to collect interest. So we cast a wide net, and the listening sessions are smaller, so not everyone gets to participate, but we do respond, and NORD communicates with the patient advocacy groups, and we coordinate the conversation with the individual patients whether or not they were selected. So everyone is informed. Anyone who has any questions gets a high touch of sensitive communication and information. So we create this survey. NORD looks at it for medical literacy, patient sensitivity, accessibility, So we have different layers of review, and then we contact the leaders of those organizations. We explain to them the project, we determine their interests, we give them a survey link that's special for their organization. So one listening session, we had 13 organizations, we created 13 marketing links, and why this is important is to know where these individuals are coming from. We don't want it to necessarily be all one nonprofit organization having all of their champions and their leaders. And not that that's something that goes into consideration, but it's something that we look at and that we're mindful of is some diversity across different organizations. But ultimately, it's the division staff that review and make their decisions based upon the responses of those surveys. The survey does collect demographic information, but most importantly, drug experience, diagnosis, understanding of the disease and disease burden. So we reach out to the leaders, we determine their interests, we give them the survey link, we give them a deadline. We also create a social media toolkit with customized links so they can share on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter, and so they can promote the listening session. The leaders of those organizations promote and contact their individual patient communities, and if they have any questions, even about the survey, you know, we talk about that. And in the first 18 months, we've really gotten to this very well-oiled machine that allows us to really engage sensitively and quickly to bring the patient community together. FDA reviews all the survey respondents and selects the candidates plus backups, and then NORD reaches out and talks to them, lets them know that they can feel comfortable and confident. If any of them express concern or hesitation, we do phone calls one-to-one with all of them, but especially if they've had concerns, then we talk to them so that when they show up on the day of the call, they feel safe and supported, and they feel open and welcome. A lot of these folks are very new. They're new to their nonprofit. They've never done anything like this before. They don't really know or understand the FDA. And those are the kind of voices that really, it's important to get them. It's important to have them included. And so that is sort of the steps from NORD's vantage point of how we work with the community to identify patients to participate. It seems painstaking, but we do have mechanisms in place. And, you know, we've all talked to these patients, and the listening sessions are incredibly powerful. We learn so much, and the patients really feel empowered, and they really feel like they've been heard. Those who were not selected are invited to participate in future activities and opportunities, and when we have our high-level notes from those listening sessions, we share them back with them. Because of NORD's relationship with FDA, we've hosted webinars for our member organizations on listening sessions, as well as how to host externally led patient-focused drug development meetings. It's a side note to this slide, but NORD welcomes new members to receive access to capacity building webinars like this, and board source membership, and hundreds of thousands of dollars in travel and registration assistance for rare disease conferences and more. And I mention this because I distinguished earlier on that we have members and they meet qualifications. You know, NORD has resources for everybody. Our doors are open for all nonprofit rare disease organizations. Our mission is the mission of our organizations, and our work with the listening sessions, our relationships with the FDA. This is just a handful of ways that NORD works to advance research and find cures for rare disease communities to serve that 30 million Americans. So that is NORD's perspective on listening sessions. Thank you. Next slide.
And this is Andrea again. Yep, thanks, Debbie. And I just want to just sort of emphasize how much work Debbie puts into this, because as she mentioned, a lot of these patients and caregivers have never interacted with FDA, and they're not even familiar really about what we do. And she really spends so much time on the phone with them, each individual, to sort of get them to a comfortable space in preparation for them. And it's just so important. And I think after we've heard feedback, some of the things that we heard is that they were like, oh, it's not as bad as I thought it would be. And I feel like that's really due to Debbie's work in helping them feel more comfortable for that first interaction with us. So thanks, Debbie. So what are people saying about these sessions? So what we do is we send out surveys to all the participants that are involved in the listening sessions after each listening session. So that means that not only the FDA internal staff, but also the patient participants. So I just want to start with sharing some of the things we hear from FDA Review Division staff. And so one staff member said that the patient caregivers who spoke did an amazing job conveying their experiences, concerns, and desires for treatments. And they were remarkable and truly appreciated hearing from them. Someone else indicated the appreciation for the discussion around mismatch endpoints and how that information can be used to inform future drug development. And the third one said the patient's comments appeared to be in line with the type of information that the agency needs to help product development for patients. Next slide, please. So here's some things that patient participants have shared with us from their experience. It's very heartening for our community to see such interest and action taken to enhance the agency's understanding of what patients and families face with Sanfilippo. Someone else said, I definitely feel the FDA heard all of our perspectives during the listening session. I thought the follow-up questions were excellent and explored our answers more deeply. So as we really try to understand what we're trying to convey. And someone else had mentioned that I felt the listening session was very valuable. I hung up the phone and said to my husband immediately, I think that went very well. They are trying hard to understand what living with gastroparesis really is like. They were really listening. So as I mentioned before, I think sometimes people who haven't interacted with FDA have a certain perspective and don't know what to expect in talking to a bureaucratic regulatory agency. But I think what Patient Affairs really tries to do, and of course NORD helps, is try to give a more friendly, welcoming space for them to feel comfortable sharing their diseases and experiences so we can better understand that. And because we're ultimately, FDA is reviewing and approving products for patients who are the end users. So we really want to understand that so that these products are being developed to meet their needs as best as possible. Next slide, please. So next steps. One of the things I did want to share here is some examples of how this information has been useful and has informed FDA staff. So things we've heard is that when they were in the process of developing guidances for different therapeutic areas, for regulatory policies, it was helpful to ask questions directly to the patients. Some were specific to pediatric patient studies, so that was helpful to them. It provided an understanding, of course, of what's important to patients and how it can improve product development. Some other information has informed what is clinical meaningful for patients and really can help identify and feed into what endpoints could be determined for that particular clinical trial. And then others just use the product for working with sponsors and in preparation for meeting with sponsors, so they can have a conversation that this is what they heard from patients and what their needs are and what their priorities are, so that things are best developed for those needs. So I think in terms of considering if you want to have a listening session, really think about what's important to your community. Why do you want to have a listening session? What's your goal for sharing your experience with FDA? And since the pilot, the listening sessions have been ongoing and we continue to hold them, but we're always open to explore other models and incorporate new ideas and new opportunities. And we also may consider expanding to other therapeutic areas, so, non-rare diseases. I'll be quite frank that that's contingent upon resources, and so it really depends on that, but it would be nice to also expand and explore how we can move it into another direction. Next slide, please. So I just want to go over some communication platforms, because I think one of the things that's important is, if you want to get involved, how can you sort of stay connected to learn what's going on and learn the opportunities that are available to you. So what we heard from patient stakeholders, especially, is that there is such confusion about where to begin at FDA. It's a very big agency. There's different components, and people see us as FDA and not specifically organizationally each of the product centers and the office of the commissioner and whatnot. So we're working to improve FDA's website so that it's better, more patient-friendly. And we're currently doing that with our Patient Engagement Collaborative, which is one of the initiatives we have. We have a 16-member group of patient advocates and caregivers and patient individuals, and we meet regularly with them. And one of the things they said that we really need to start focusing on is the communications piece. So this is why we're starting with a website. And the improvements are based on the web assessment that we had done through interviews with patient community representatives. And we're taking those recommendations and implementing them. And we're currently in the process of doing that now, and we'll be doing some user testing as well. The other thing is, the other thing is we want to keep connected through Twitter. For example, like sharing important FDA safety announcements, or where's PAS? Where are we? We're attending a conference or speaking somewhere. Or do we have upcoming webinars that you might be interested in? We also have an educational video series called Patients Matter. And these were developed to help patients and caregivers better understand FDA, the various programs that exist, and how you can get further involved. PAS also manages a large database of patient advocacy organizations. And we send information like targeted emails to patient communities through that database that are specific communications relevant around FDA issues that are specific to community stakeholders. So, we're not going to just blast everyone with everything, but if there's like something about a certain rare disease, we'll look at our database of organizations and maybe send that communication specifically. And of course, NORD always helps spread the word, which is we're always appreciative of. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to share this slide to demonstrate that there are so many opportunities and possibilities and ways to get involved with FDA. And these initiatives and programs are specific to each of the medical product centers that I have mentioned. There are so many, but wanted to just demonstrate that patient affairs isn't the only way you can get involved. Next slide, please. And so if you do have interest in all these other activities, whether they're PAS or specific to the medical product centers, this is a resource for you. It's just so you have information on how to contact each of these initiatives and get more information should you be interested in getting more involved. Next slide, please. And so if you do really want to get involved and you're not sure which initiative you want to be involved in based on what your objectives are for connecting with FDA, we heard, again, loud and clear, and we listened very carefully to our stakeholders. Patients and caregivers were like, we were confused. Where do we start contacting the FDA? So what we did is we worked closely with the medical product centers in creating that front door to specifically address the issues and how to submit an inquiry or a meeting request with FDA. And the patient portal that you see here is called Patients Ask FDA. And it was leveraged off an already existing system that the Center for Drugs had developed called Request a Meeting on Drugs. And so we are very thankful that CEDAR got the ball rolling, and we were able to leverage that and expand it to include all the medical product centers. And so we piloted the web form and refined it based on patient stakeholder feedback. And so I really encourage you to visit Patients@FDA if you have any questions or if you're interested in meeting with FDA. Next slide, please. And so we just thank you for your attention, and we're always here, both NORD and FDA, we're always here to assist. So when in doubt, just contact us. And Debbie, I don't know if you have any other final words?
Debbie, you might be muted if you're speaking.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I muted my line. I just wanted to say that I appreciate the opportunity to talk about our work on the listening sessions, and really wanted to say thank you to the Food and Drug Administration Patient Affairs staff. They really have listened to the community and have done a lot of work in bringing in the patient voice. And also, I'm looking forward to the questions from the participants on the line.
Great, thank you so much, both of you. We have had a number of questions come in, so I will get started with asking you the questions. And again, just to reiterate, for folks who have questions, please feel free to submit those via the chat function. The first question was about, let's see, where are we now? Okay, is there consideration given to devices in addition to drugs as part of the listening session? So I think this is getting a little bit at also where the sessions originate from, the request for sessions, whether they come from CDRH, whether they come from CEDAR, CBER, and so on and so forth.
Thank you for that question. And yes, that's a really good question to clarify. So the requests that come in from FDA staff could come from any of those medical product centers that you mentioned. But because we're in the office of the commissioner, our focus, as I mentioned earlier, is on cross-cutting issues. So any request for listening session that's on a particular disease or condition should be focused that's going to be helpful to more than one medical product center. So for example, if something came in from the Center for Drugs Review Division staff and they said we're interested in a listening session on a particular disease, we reach out to the other medical product centers to see if there is other interest across the centers. And if there is really a specific issue to that one medical product center, as I mentioned, there's other patient engagement components in each of the centers, and they would take the lead on that. But for the ones out of patient affairs, they are certainly cross-center.
Thanks, Andrea. One other question is, at what point, or typically the time point, do the FDA staff typically request meetings? So is it typically when there's some type of an upcoming review that may be within one of the divisions, or is it completely before a potential review? Could you speak a little bit to the timing of the FDA requested meeting?
Sure. The requests come in at any given time. It really depends on what they are working on and trying to understand with a particular rare disease. As I mentioned previously, how some of this information has been used. I know that in the past they were working on guidances in that particular disease area, and so they wanted to understand from patients their perspectives, and it helped inform them finishing to write the guidance. It has been used to prepare for a public meeting they're working on, and really further develop the agenda to get at the real core of the issues for that particular disease. And sometimes it just helps in preparation for meeting with sponsors. I'll tell you from my experience, what I've heard from review divisions is we hear from sponsors that, you know, XYZ is important to patients, but FDA would really like to hear directly from patients and caregivers themselves, and just to verify that that is what's important to them when it comes to medical product development. So there's so many different reasons why FDA review division staff might want to connect with patients and caregivers directly, but those are some examples.
Thank you. And one of the other questions is if you have any specific suggestions for or advice for organizations that are interested in or preparing for hosting a patient-requested session.
You know, I think what's important to consider is timing. I always feel like, you know, depending on if there's products being developed, I know that a lot of organizations have relationships with product sponsors and companies, so they might know where a product is in the pipeline for development. I think I remember one example where an organization had said to me, you know, we were planning to reach out to do actually a patient-focused drug development meeting, and for one reason or another, they just couldn't get it scheduled or get, you know, really coordinate it, you know, for about a year. And they said it worked out well for them because within that year period, there was a new discovery within their disease, which changed the conversation and changed the shift of what they wanted to focus on when it comes to drug development. So I think timing is something to consider. You know, and is it, you know, trying to figure out that sort of sweet spot. You know, you don't want to go too early where there may be some new discoveries with that particular disease or condition because it's early on, like sometimes disease and conditions in the rare space don't even have a name yet. So, or, you know, you don't want to be too late either. But, you know, that's some of the things that patient affairs is happy to have conversation with and help you think through some of these ideas. So we're always happy to have those conversations.
Thanks. And another question is, could you speak about any information you might have learned during these listening sessions that has been learned about clinical outcome assessment and the questionnaires that might be used? This would include patient-reported or caregiver-reported measures.
I really can't speak to that at this point because really what our listening sessions are focused on is really connecting FDA staff with the patient community directly so that the review staff can understand disease experience. And I can't really speak to that specific like COAs or PROs as it relates to listening sessions. But again, I think, you know, we just finished the pilot in summer of last year. And I think as we go forward, one of the things we do want to do is sort of explore more deeply how this information is being utilized and can inform those types of things. So that's something to be continued, I would say.
Thanks, Andrea. And one other question is, could you please touch on some ways FDA and NORD share with your counterpart organizations globally to extend the reach and deepen understanding? So, go ahead.
And so when you say extend globally, meaning incorporating global perspectives as well?
I think that this question is in terms of the best practices that you're learning as part of this practice, if that's being shared back a feedback loop to maybe EMA or to Urordis or to other counterparts.
Yes. So one of the things I did not talk much about, because today is really focused on the rare disease listening sessions, we have a very good relationship and collaboration with EMA, the European Medicines Agency, where we have a patient engagement cluster. If you're not aware, there's a number of different clusters in various therapeutic areas between FDA and EMA. I want to say there's close to 20 now, some like pharmacovigilance, oncology. There's one specifically for rare diseases. Ours is focused on patient engagement, and we meet with the EMA quarterly, and we share our experiences and our approaches for engaging in our patient communities and our programs and initiatives and lessons learned. And they have a huge interest in the listening sessions. And actually, we published an article together to talk about our learnings. We had a mutual fellowship exchange several years ago, and from that exchange and from our continued interactions through the patient engagement cluster, we have published an article about our lessons learned and things we have implemented from those learnings from each other, and I can share that with you if you have interest.
Thanks, Andrea. I think it sounds like a topic that would be a great topic for an upcoming webinar, actually. I think there would be a lot of interest from our members in that specific area as well.
Mm-hmm.
Debbie, did you want to speak at all about any international collaboration?
I can say that when we hosted our webinars for listening sessions with FDA staff, and when Andrea and I speak to our registry platform users, that our membership and our member organizations also include Urordis. They include umbrella organizations from around the country, from around the world. But in terms of NORD's work, we don't do that work of sharing this case study with international regulatory bodies, but we do share this information with our members, of which many of them are from around the world.
Thank you. And one additional question is, just a clarifying question, is that listening sessions and the opportunity to submit a request for a listening session, that's open to all types of chronic conditions and not just rare disorders. Is that correct?
So the focus has been primarily for rare disorders. However, we have done some for non-rare. So, you know, if the request comes in, of course, we would have a conversation and see if there's, you know, a need for it internally, and certainly entertain that. We would definitely not turn it away, but we would just have a conversation about it. And only just, it's not because we're trying to exclude, you know, some other disease areas. It's just, seriously, it's just a matter of resources. Patient affairs is a four-person team, and it gets challenging at times, because one of the things that we wanted to make sure is that when we do these patient listening sessions, that they're of high quality and they're done well. And we don't want to be stretched so thin that, you know, we're sort of, they're not providing added value on either end from FDA or the patient community. We want to really make sure that they're done very in a very solid process based on our pilot, and that we are incorporating those principles as best as possible. So, but like I said, we really want to see how we can expand on a regular basis, again, non-rare diseases and conditions, but when we do get those requests, of course, we do look at them, and we have done some that are non-rare.
Thank you. Well, those were all of the questions that came in. It was quite a few, actually. So Thank you so much, both Andrea and Debbie, for your presentations and also for fielding the questions that came in. We really appreciate it. We wanted to announce the topic and date for our next webinar. The next webinar in this series will be on observer-reported or proxy-reported. Is one better than the other? And that will be on February the 24th, 2020. And then finally, I wanted to make the note that we have all of our webinars. I think there's been 12 so far that have been that we've done since November of 2018, and those are all accessible via our website. We'll also always post information about registration. And finally, I wanted to make sure that everybody saw we are celebrating 100 years this year, and so we'll be having a number of special events throughout the year in recognition of our anniversary. So stay tuned for those too. We'll be sure to share them with this group. Again, thank you so much, Andrea and Debbie. We really appreciate you presenting.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. And congratulations on your 100 years.
Thank you. We're really excited about it.